Tokyo, the capital city of Japan, known for its incredible transit system, amazing food, and culture that brings visitors from far and
I was
wide.
told everyone would be dressed like this.
But something you probably don't know Tokyo for is its affordable housing. Look at this graph of rental prices in Tokyo Prefecture over the last 15 years. The average cost of a rental has barely risen 20%. That's an increase in rent that many Americans, especially in places like New York, are facing in a single year. And when you compare the price per square foot to other big international cities, the trend holds. Tokyo is cheaper than it should be, no matter the size of the apartment. Why is the cost of living in Tokyo so stable? If you know anything about Japan, you might be thinking this is due to their declining and aging population. After all, less people means less competition for existing housing. But this isn't the case. The population of Tokyo is still growing. In fact, the population of the city grew by about 1 million people in the same period that rents only rose 20%. Part of the answer is that the biggest city in the world has kept the cost of living stable because they build a lot. Look at this data from the Japanese census. When you compare the households to the number of housing units, Tokyo has had more housing than households every year since 1968, and they continue to build on that surplus. So what I want to know is, what happened around 1968? What changed that allowed Tokyo to be the land of housing abundance while American cities continue to stagnate? This is a story about smart urban design, about good public policy and how the choices of governments can impact our lives and the fabric of our environments for decades. So how is Tokyo building more housing than almost any city in the world? And can we apply these lessons to fix the American housing crisis? The story of housing in Tokyo starts with what is known as the Japanese economic miracle, the time between World War II and the end of the Cold War when Japan exploded. I mean, look at this graph of Japanese economic growth starting after the war. It's just a wall, it's a line going straight up. The Japanese surrender in World War II brought about the end of the war, and Japan was in pretty bad shape. Tons of domestic industry had been converted during wartime to create supplies and weapons. Huge conglomerates held monopoly power over the remaining industries. There was a major shortage of housing due to air raid bombing and a lack of regulation around land use. After the surrender, the United States and the Allies intervened in the Japanese economy. They wrote the new Japanese constitution. They invested money in Japanese society because, selfishly, the Allies felt that a weak Japanese economy could lead to the rise of communism and secure Russian influence in the region, which they didn't want.
During the years of Japan's struggle for new life, the menace of Soviet aggression began to spread over the Orient.
They oversaw the dissolution of the Japanese military as a condition of their surrender, with the understanding that the United States would primarily oversee national defense. And in 1950, at the outbreak of the Korean War, the US made Japan its central strategic base in Asia, which led to even further investment in the country. These changes and reforms led to the economic miracle. Massive public spending that would have been used for the military was spent on public works, and Japan quickly became the second largest economy in the world behind the United States. As cities and their populations grew, lack of regulations created problems though, congestion and pollution. And the US and the international community wasn't just bringing money into Japan. Technology, know-how, ways of organizing governments were also exchanged, which influenced the Japanese way of life. Part of that influence was suburbanization. Tokyo suburbanized because that's what advanced economies did at the time. They followed trends in the United States. Cities grew outward as they gained population, leading to urban sprawl. Unchecked growth in cities also caused flight to the suburbs, as a lack of regulations led to pollution and congestion. But the suburban growth came with many of the same problems. The Japanese government was pursuing economic growth at basically any cost, and this led to more unchecked pollution, issues with traffic, and yes, issues with housing deficits in major cities. Population growth was exceeding the housing market, primarily due to poor city planning. That sounds familiar. This leads us to the new city planning law of 1968, a new national law which was passed with the goal of reforming the city planning process, curbing issues with suburbanization, and provided the foundation for Japanese zoning. This is the law that changed everything and paved the way for housing abundance in Tokyo. Japan has a unique system of zoning that you don't really see in the United States. Look at this breakdown of Japanese zoning from the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transport. Most cities in the United States have a complicated system with hundreds of zones for different uses. This system only has 12 zones, and it encourages mixed uses. Sure, there's a zone that's set aside for only low-rise residential use and for schools, but critically, housing can be built in every single other zone. Sure, there's a zone for smaller businesses and restaurants, but if you want to build housing there, you can. And there's a zone that allows offices and commercial buildings, but housing is allowed there too. That's because Japanese zoning is inclusive, and this inclusivity has a few critical effects. First, Tokyo can build a ton of housing. Remember this graph from earlier? Now we can put this in the context of Japanese policy changes. This is what happened in 1968. The national government reformed city planning law, and that was the last year that Tokyo ever had a housing shortage. Every single year since then, they've had more housing than households. But second, this inclusivity also allows for higher density. Tokyo can build walkable, mixed-use neighborhoods, places where public transit is viable, where cafes and small shops exist below apartments, where schools are just around the corner, and where religious sites are right next to train stations. In short, places you would actually want to live, and most importantly, where you can afford to live. So how is Japanese zoning different from zoning in the United States? Now look at this zoning map of New York City. This is America's most densely populated city, and yet everything you see here in yellow is zoned for single or two-family use, and nothing else is allowed here. American cities don't zone for mixed uses. They use a system called Euclidean zoning. Euclidean zoning sets aside parts of the city for exclusive single uses: housing, retail, commercial. This isn't just a New York City thing. This is the most common type of zoning in America. But what happens when a city follows this pattern of zoning and the housing zones fill up? Well, this happens.
Bronx to Brooklyn, across New York City, rents are taking no prisoners.
They planned on raising our rent 74%.
A lot of these COVID leases, they're expiring, so a lot of people are finding that they can't afford to stay.
Couple worries that if the bill doesn't pass, only millionaires will be left in Manhattan.
Housing becomes unaffordable, rents rise, cities can't build enough housing to meet demand. And that's to say nothing of how Euclidean zoning causes urban sprawl, increases dependence on cars, which increases pollution, makes neighborhoods unwalkable, allows for worse racial segregation, makes public transit less viable. You get my point. Because of these laws, New York City is facing a housing shortage and has some of the most insane rental prices in the world. They just can't build enough. New York City started construction on just under 30,000 new housing units in 2020. Tokyo started 130,000 units. And the year before that, they started 140,000, and the same the year before that. The fact is, New York City is working from behind. One study estimates the city would need 560,000 additional housing units by 2030, with an additional need for 227,000 units right now. This could have been the situation in Tokyo, but the government and city planners in Japan saw the writing on the wall and changed policy early. Now you might think, okay, just change the zoning laws. If the housing zones fill up, let's rezone and allow for more housing in other areas, otherwise known as upzoning, changing the zone to allow for higher density or mixed uses. But now you're stumbling upon another way that the Japanese system of zoning is unique. In Japan, the 12 zones are determined by the national government. But in American Euclidean zoning, the zones are determined locally. Enter the NIMBY movement.
People don't want it near them. We got something in this country, you've heard of it, it's called NIMBY, N-I-M-B-Y. Not in my backyard.
It's prime land that's ripe for development. The issue is what should go there. And residents in Alameda say a homeless center is not going to cut it.
There's a whole other group of people in here that has a different set of values than you do, and the values you're proposing are very scary to us.
I've invested millions of dollars in town. If you push this thing through, what I'm investing in is no longer applicable.
The NIMBY movement is a group of existing residents and homeowners that fight new development, usually under the guise of not wanting to change the neighborhood character. They show up at local meetings and oppose new housing, often because more housing means the value of their property won't continue to rise. But in Tokyo, there is no NIMBY movement. Land use is determined mostly by the person who owns it. Community input on new housing isn't requested, and nobody expects their opinion on what their neighbor is building to matter. The fact of the matter is that American cities can have affordable housing. It just requires making the right policy choices. In 1968, the Japanese government made those choices, and decades later, Tokyo is the land of housing abundance. Meanwhile, look at any American city to see the impact of Euclidean zoning. Rents continue to rise even in mid-sized cities, let alone the biggest city in the country. Lack of housing is forcing people out of city life. More and more Americans are becoming rental cost burdened, and they do so at the pleasure of existing property owners, who all too often think that building affordable housing is important, they just don't think it should be built here. But in Tokyo, housing should be built here, and there, and everywhere, and the city is better off for it. The sooner American cities can learn that lesson, the better.